Once a place where lovers met in the twilight, a gentle slope on the Flanders landscape became known to the British Tommy as Hill 60, an infamous corner of the battlefields around Ypres, where perhaps as many as 8,000 men still lie beneath its slopes. We return to Flanders for this episode, which in many ways is quite fitting because I wanted to begin this week by paying tribute to an old friend of mine who sadly passed away last week. Jackie Platou was known to many of you who visit the Ypres battlefields. He was a member of the Last Post Association, who ensure that the Last Post is continued to be played at the Menin Gate every evening in remembrance of those 250,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who died in defence of Ypres during the Great War. Jackie had worked there for many years as a marshal, and many of you going on your own private visits or perhaps with adult or school groups will have encountered him in enabling you to carry out your acts of remembrance. And he was an incredibly generous and funny person with a great sense of humour, and someone who I'd had the luck to be out on the battlefields with on several occasions over the years. And way back in the early 2000s, Jackie had been involved in a local amateur archaeology group called the Diggers, and they'd been responsible for the excavation of the site around Bosinger. And thanks to Jackie, I had a chance to go and have a look at that, see the work they were doing uncovering the trenches there, and also going down into some of the dugouts that they were unearthing. And this eventually led to a magnificent exhibition in the Bosinger School, which was attended by a BBC producer called John Hayes Fisher, who realised the potential of this, and this led to eventually to the broadcast of a documentary on the work of the Diggers called Forgotten Battlefield, in which I appeared as one of the contributors. So that part of the battlefields, and Jackie and his great friend Aurel Secou, they're forever part really of my sort of anchors, as it were, to the Great War battlefields, part of that old guard who have been on the ground for so long and who have ensured that the torch of remembrance burns brightly. And in the case of both Jackie and Aurel and the other Diggers, they'd also ensured that the recovery of soldiers from the battlefield had taken place, and these men were just no longer anonymous casualties buried beneath Flanders fields. They were in properly marked graves, and that wasn't just British soldiers, but it was French and German too, so important work. But Jackie Platou was much more than just a member of the Last Post Association and the Diggers. He'd written 2 fantastic books on Ypres, he contributed to others, and he had a phenomenal knowledge of the ground, not just as it is today, but of its history too. And of course, in this last extraordinary year that we've all experienced, getting out to the battlefields has been nigh on impossible, apart from a few short opportunities. And last July I was pleased to be able to get over with some friends and see Jackie at Hoog Crater Cafe and sit down and have lunch with him and have a good catch up. And Jackie was a great supporter of this podcast. In fact, we'd only spoken about a week or so before his death when he contacted me to say how much he'd enjoyed the episode on the Menin Gate. So with the passing of someone like him, it's not just a friend that I feel I've lost. I feel as if yet another part of the old battlefields and that battlefield's history has passed with him. And I've seen so much of this over the years with so many of those people that really became part of the battlefields themselves in a small way. But through his work and through the dedication of an organisation like the Last Post Association, the history, the remembrance, the highlighting of the importance of the Great War and those who were in it continues. So this episode this week is dedicated to Jackie, a good mate who I know many of us will miss. Back in Flanders, we're just to the south of the city of Ypres, very close to the village of Zillebeek, and we're on a road junction. We're in the road coming out of Zillebeek onto the Hollebeek road that runs from Ypres near what was called Shrapnel Corner, down past Transport Farm and Zillebeek Lake, and around past this junction and continues across the ground around the Brandonmolen, Hill 60 and the Palinbeek out towards Hollebeek. And we're standing at what is a T-junction in a little island in the middle of the road where there is a memorial stone in front of us, which we'll come to in just a moment. But where we're standing here, if we look to our right, we're looking back towards the city of Ypres. We can see the spires of Ypres with the Cloth Hall and St Martin's Cathedral and St Jack's Church in the distance there. We can see to our half right, back towards the village of Zillebeek slightly, the trees that line the edge of the Zillebeek Lake, that big mass of water, which we've walked on a previous walk in the podcast when we walked from behind the lines up towards the front line around Maple Copse and Observatory Ridge. To the left of Zillebeek Lake is Transport Farm, so named because that's where the battalion transports came to and unloaded their rations and stores and ammunition and everything else. There was a dressing station there where medical personnel from the Royal Army Medical Corps and for a sizable chunk of the war, the Canadian Army Medical Corps treating wounded coming back from the front line around Hill 60 and Saint-Éloi and the Bluff, treated the wounded and relayed them onto the casualty clearing stations back further towards Popperinga. And of course, sadly, many men died of their wounds, and Transport Farm Cemetery is located there. If we look to our left down the roads, we're looking up towards the destination that we're walking to today, and that is Hill 60, probably one of the most infamous parts of the Ypres battlefield. Throughout the 4 years of the war, there was almost constant fighting there one way and another, and that's where we're heading to. So we can see that in the distance, and we can see how the ground rises slightly there onto what is the northern part of the Messines Ridge. And to the right of that road is the hamlet of a Brandonmolen. Molen is the Dutch for a windmill, and there was a mill there before the war. And it's a wooded area that cuts across towards the old Ypres-Commune Canal in the area known as the Bluff. So what we're doing in this walk is really approaching the battlefield in the same way that a typical British or Canadian unit that served in this area would have done during the war, from coming up through the village of Zillebeek, perhaps coming down the road via Transport Farm from Shrapnel Corner, and then getting into the communication trenches that would have begun in this area, and then moving up towards the front line itself around that infamous position of Hill 60. For most of the war, the fighting in this area revolved around that little rising ground known as Hill 60, but there was that decisive moment in April 1918 when the Germans amassed enough forces to break through in Flanders and almost completely engulf the whole area around Ypres and Ypres itself, but they were stopped. And this here, where we're standing at this junction, is very close to one of those places where the German army was stopped at that time, which is why this memorial on the island where we're standing now is here. This is a demarcation stone designed by the architect, the sculptor Vaultier, a Vaultier born, as it's often described as in the French sources. And these were placed both on the battlefields here in Belgium and in France by cycle touring clubs to mark the front line, to mark the limit of the German advance in 1918. The stones proclaim, "Here the invader was brought to a standstill." And the original intent of these was to have probably hundreds of them mark the entire front, from the very north on the beach at Newport right down to the south where it ended on the border with Switzerland, so along 450 miles of the Western Front. In the end, probably around about 150 or so were constructed. And we say 150 or so because the exact number is honestly not known, because a large number were not properly recorded, it seems, and quite a few were lost in the Second World War. Now, there's a very good website that maps the known demarcation stones, and I'll put a link to that on the Old Front Line podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, and you can look at this interactive map, see where the known demarcation stones were located, click on them, and it gives you their status. Either it's still there and it shows a photograph of it, or it's damaged, as quite a few of them were. The one at Hartmann's Villekopf right down in the Vosges was damaged, for example. There's one near Massige, where we were in the previous episode of the podcast, which was scythed in half by a German tank shell in 1940, and there are others that are completely lost. And there are three designs of these demarcation stones. Ones like this, which has got the shape of a British helmet on the top, indicating that you're in a British sector of the Western Front where the Germans were stopped. One with a Belgian helmet on the top, so the one at the very northern part of the Western Front on the beach, in fact overlooking the beach at Newport, has got a Belgian helmet on it. And then the majority, because most of the front, of course, was in France and defended by French troops, have French-style helmets on them. So it was one of these projects to try in some way to memorialise the line of the Western Front. When we spoke to Mathilde, who works at the Lens 1418 Museum, we discovered from her about the idea of the French putting these lighthouses at different points along the Western Front, like the one at Notre Dame de Lorette and the one on the Osserie à Douaumont. That was never quite complete. And the Demarcation Stones, as we said, that wasn't really complete either, but it does offer you a way to look at a map and see where the line ran by the placement of the stones. So it's quite an interesting thing to do. And I've not visited them all over the years, but I've seen quite a number of them. And some, as we've said, are in better conditions than others. But it's a fascinating aspect. And many different organisations and indeed countries were involved in the sponsoring of these demarcation stones. From Americans doing one on the Somme, for example, and even the one outside Fort La Pompelle on the Marne, east of Reims, that was sponsored by the Association of Mexican Volunteers who had fought on the Western Front during the Great War. So like the cemeteries and the official memorials that mark the battlefields of the First World War, these demarcation stones are important beacons really on the battlefields to increase our understanding and enhance our knowledge of where the front was at different points. And it's quite interesting just to follow them around a given region and see which points were memorialised as opposed to others. So in April 1918, when the Germans broke through here, they were stopped here, and that meant that the front line was now around the village of Zillebeek. It had fallen to the Germans, and behind us, Hill 60 and the rising ground on this part of the Messines Ridge had all fallen in the German advance at that stage. And the front line beyond Zillebeek Lake and around Transport Farm, that's where the British positions were located, literally just outside the Lille Gate to the south of Ypres itself. And it remained like that until the summer of 1918, when British, assisted in this area by American troops in the 27th New York and the 30th Tennessee Divisions, took part in some of the early summer engagements here prior to the fourth and final Battle of Ypres, when this ground was finally retaken. And if we'd have stood here then when the war ended, we'd have seen the village of Zillebeek behind us there completely just reduced to rubble, the largest pile being the church. We'd have seen the shattered trees around the edge of the Zillebeek Lake. We'd have seen the ruins of Ypres like some great lost civilization in the distance there. And we'd have looked up towards Hill 60 and seen that shattered ground, already nature beginning to reclaim the trenches and the shell holes, but amongst it the barbed wire and the detritus of war. This is what the landscape looked like when the war was over. But we're going to continue, or begin our journey really from here, and follow that typical route, let's call it, up to the front line at Hill 60. We're going to turn left at this junction, go up the road, and as the road bends a little bit further up, there's a track off to the left that will take us across the railway line and to the entrance of a military cemetery. We've come over the railway line now to the entrance of this cemetery, and beyond the entrance there's a little path that takes you to the cemetery itself. We'll get to that in just a minute. But the railway line that we've come over is the line that runs from Popperinge to Ypres, and then Ypres across towards Comines, close to the French border, and beyond to Courtrai. As we mentioned in a recent episode of the podcast, when we walked the ground between Ypres Station and the Menin Gate, the trains originally ran all the way into France as well from Popperinge, and there was a line that took them across the border towards Hazebrouck. Now, during the war, when the front line was just up the road at Hill 60, there were no trains running along here then, and no trains ran again until after the First World War. But again, it's quite an interesting journey to do on train from Ypres. We spoke about how it's quite interesting to go from Ypres to Popperinge, but you can come the other way and come through here, and the train brings you out near Shrapnel Corner, around the back of Transport Farm and Transport Farm Cemetery. You can see Zillebeek Lake in the distance and the church of Zillebeek as well. over this ground past Larchwood Cemetery, which is what we're about to visit now, up over through the cutting at Hill 60, and then round the side of Battle Wood to Hollebeek, and along that stretch, the far stretch of the Messines Ridge, where the offensive came to its conclusion in June of 1917, and from which the Germans attacked in the April 1918 battle the following year, when they broke through on that part of the front. So again, it's a journey worth doing that gives a slightly different dimension to visiting the battlefields of the Great War. We'll make our way into the cemetery now, and we'll go through the gates and we'll walk along the path. The trains pass by here on a regular basis, and it's quite a nice way to have the modern world infringe on the quiet solitude of the cemeteries, and that sort of echo of the trains as they go by echoes, I suppose, in some respects, the importance of the trains on the battlefields of the Great War. As we come into Larchwood Cemetery ahead of us, we see a number of plots unfolding before us. This was a front-line cemetery started in April 1915 during the period of the Second Battle of Ypres, when the front lines around Hill 60 were being hotly contested during the first German use of poison gas in the First World War here on the Western Front. And so men killed up in that part of the battlefield, and included, for example, men from the 1st Battalion, the Dorsetshire Regiment, who were heavily involved in the battles around Hill 60, which for that particular battalion is well described in Ernest Shepard's A Sergeant Major's War, which was published in the 1980s and has been republished a few times since. And I'll put a link to that excellent memoir of the First World War based on his diaries on the podcast website. So a frontline cemetery begun during a battle. It was then used in the static period of trench warfare that followed, that long 2-year period from the end of the Second Battle of Ypres in the summer of 1915 through to the beginning of the Third Battle of Ypres in the summer of 1917, 2 years later. And one unit in particular that used this cemetery in that early stage was the 46th North Midland Division. They were a Midland Territorial Division that had battalions of the Leicesters, the Sherwood Foresters, the North Staffordshires, the South Staffordshires, and they held this sector prior to moving down to the Messines Ridge and then eventually going on to fight in the Battle of Loos in October of 1915, suffering heavy casualties in the attack on the Hohenzollern Redoubt, and then the following year on the Somme-Gommecourt were annihilated in the assault there. This was one of their earliest periods of trench warfare, and when we walk amongst their graves in plot 1 of this cemetery, we see some of the original Midland Territorials buried here from all those different regiments. So it gives us a good cross-section of the sort of men that had joined that units or those units at the beginning of the First World War. The cemetery remained in use right up until April 1918, when the Germans took this ground, and obviously there were no further burials. It could be that the Germans buried some of their dead here, which wasn't uncommon during that period, and they were then subsequently removed. But post-war, it was decided to make it a permanent cemetery, and they brought in 245 burials from quite a wide area, and it included many burials from what were then closed German cemeteries. So these were cemeteries that, even at that stage, had been decided not to keep those German cemeteries, but move them into other existing German cemeteries like Langemark or Polkapelle or Menin or many of the others that existed at that time, far more than exist today. But the British graves were then moved to sites like this. So some of these are men shot down behind the German lines serving with the flying services, or men who died as prisoners of war. And some of the burials come from right up on the Belgian coast, so it's quite a wide area. In total now there are 614 British burials, 85 Canadians, 35 Australians, 1 soldier of the British West Indies Regiment, and 33 men whose unit is not known. Of the burials, 321 are unknown, and there are 81 special memorials of men who are known to be buried in the cemetery, but the exact location of their grave was lost in later battles, probably from the shell fire here in that spring and into the summer period of 1918, when this was just behind the German lines. So the original plots give us a good cross-section of the men and the units that passed through here. Some of the Canadians are men that were holding front line here in the spring and summer of 1916, when the front line was pretty static around Hill 60, for example. But the ones that were moved in post-war, to some degree, have lost their sort of context, because they're now buried quite some distance from where they actually died. But amongst the army burials that were brought in are quite a few from the early period of the war, and one includes the grave of Lieutenant Jack Eden of the 12th Lancers, who was killed on the 17th of October 1914, aged 26. He was the elder brother of Anthony Eden, who fought not far away with the 21st Battalion King's Royal Rifle Corps in the early period of his trench warfare down at Plug Street Wood, and later on in the Battle of Messines in 1917. I don't believe that he had a chance to visit his brother's grave during the war itself, but the loss of his brother is described in his memoirs, Another World, and he describes how the loss of his brother had such a terrible effect on his mother. And we often talk about how the women back home in Britain and in the wider Commonwealth, or Empire as it was then, who lost sons in the war, or lost brothers, or lost husbands, or lost boyfriends and fiancés, those women were as much casualties of the Great War as the men that they'd lost, because they forever lived in the shadow of that loss and had to live with the grief that follows on from such a loss like that. And I must say, it's something that I find myself thinking about more and more as I read about the Great War, as we've had this time in the last year to have more time to read about the sacrifice of so many men on the battlefields, and wandering around and reading some of the inscriptions from wives and mothers on the headstones. It does make you ponder upon this fact, the wider effect, the resonance of loss beyond the battlefield itself, and how it affected people back home. If we go to the back wall of the cemetery, we can look up to Hill 60. The railway line's on our right. It goes up towards where the front lines were, and we can see a rise in ground with some trees on it, which is called the dump, which we're going to visit shortly. And then to the left of that is the cutting, and then to the left of that again is Hill 60 itself. So we're looking at it from the perspective of men behind the lines, and the communication trenches began just around where this cemetery is located and took units from the area behind us up towards the very front line itself. Now we'll return back through the cemetery, go along the path, go out through the gate, turn left, go back over the railway, and ideally there would be a path that would run along the edge of the railway line, run up to the dump and Hill 60. They haven't quite got that far yet, so in reality you have to follow it back to the road, then turn left, go up that road to the next junction, go left again, and then up towards the bridge over the railway cutting, and just before that take a track off to the left that takes you down to the dump. So whichever route you're going to follow, either following along the edge of the railway line or along the road and round to the dump, that'll be our next stop. The dump where we're standing now is quite literally a dump. It's a dump of soil. The railway line that was constructed here in the mid-19th century at this point came up to the rising ground of what we would go on to call the Messines Ridge. And to get through onto the next section of where the track would run, they had to create a cutting here. And the spoil from that cutting was thrown up either side of where the track would be placed, creating, as we'll discuss shortly, Hill 60 on one side, and then a big pile of it was placed here. And at the time of the Great War, it was still here, overgrown, undergrowth and trees on it, and it ended up forming part of the positions just behind the British front line in this area. It's also where a lot of the mining galleries began from. This was an area where the tunnellers were based, and there was a continuous fear throughout most of the war that the Germans would break through at Hill 60 and take the dump, giving them yet another terrain feature to sit up on the top of and have a perfect view into the ground around and into itself the city of Ypres. And I was reading in one of the tunnelling accounts recently how there was plans to mine this particular location, so place an active mine in the area around the dump itself, so if the Germans ever overran it, they would blow it. Now, I've no evidence as to whether that was eventually used in April 1918 when the Germans did come over this ground. It's difficult to tell when you visit this site today because it once again is overgrown and there's trees upon it, and signs of the war are pretty sparse except perhaps in the winter months. But the fear was enough, and who knows, we talk about the lost mines of the Great War, of which there are many places along the Western Front where subterranean charges still lie dormant. Who knows, perhaps there's one under here. But whatever, this was the hub really for the the British and Commonwealth tunnelling units of the Great War in this part of Flanders. And in many respects, the ground around Hill 60 was the very epicentre of Flanders tunnelling for a big chunk of the war. French tunnellers had been here in 1914 and 15. They had handed over to divisional mining companies, so ad hoc units formed from men who'd worked as miners before the war but were in infantry battalions. There was one here, for example, formed by men from the Monmouthshire Regiment, who was a Welsh territorial battalion with a lot of ex-miners in it. And they created these mining companies. And then in the summer of 1915, the tunnelling war was formalised a bit more on the British side with the creation of tunnelling companies of the Royal Engineers that operated at different points along the British sector of the Western Front. And for the next year or so, British tunnellers would be heavily involved in the activities beneath the battlefield here at Hill 60. Then Canadian tunnellers would move in. The mining galleries that would lead up to the creation of the two mines that would be blown here as part of the Battle of Messines were essentially built by them at that stage and then later handed over to Australian tunnellers from the first Australian Tunnelling Company, who finished the job off and the ones that blew the mines here in June of 1917. I was reading in some of the 20 years after magazines recently, and in a couple of the memoirs that describe visits to the battlefields in that interwar period, how the area around the dump was part of the general battlefield visit to Hill 60 in that interwar 1920s and 30s period, and that some of the mining galleries and dugouts here were opened up to visitors. There's no sign of that today, but there is this new footpath that takes you from the road near the railway bridge at Hill 60 down into this area, and it would be good to see some of this joined up really to create a walking route almost from the Little Gate up past Transport Farm and Zillebeek Lake, following the front line and the battlefields around Zillebeek itself, and up through Larch Wood to here, maybe one day. But going towards the edge of the railway cutting, and obviously not going onto the railway itself, but you can look up the cutting towards the bridge in the area of Hill 60 and get an idea of the importance of that ground ahead of you. So we'll return via the path back to the road, and that will bring us into the approach to this first part of Hill 60 itself. We're standing on the road now with the road bridge over the railway cutting to our left and Hill 60 just over there. The road goes off to our right and joins the Hollebeek, the Ypres Hollebeek Road just there, and ahead of us is an open bit of pasture land with a footpath and a gate we can see on the edge of the wooded area, and then a wooded area ahead of us where one of the mine craters is located, the Caterpillar crater, which we'll get to in a minute. Where we're standing here, we're pretty much on the British front line for a big chunk of the war, and just ahead of us on the edge of the road there's a big long panoramic photograph taken in I think about 1915 showing the panorama of this part of the front and what this section of Hill 60 looked like at that stage, and it's worth having a look at that. And essentially what we're about to do now is to cross over no man's land, so from the British front line over towards the German front line via that narrow strip of ground which formed part of no man's land in this area. And we're also crossing over part of the ground where the 1st 9th Battalion, the London Regiment, the Queen Victoria Rifles, fought their action here, which results in the award of a Victoria Cross to one of their officers, which more shortly in April of 1915 during the gas attack here in the Second Battle of Ypres. So we'll walk across that ground now, and it's when you do this, when you know that you're walking from a British front line to what was the German front line, and you see how perilously close they were and how quickly you can walk this ground, you realise just how close together the armies of the Great War lived and fought and indeed died. And it's quite a sobering thing to do. And now, with one of the centenary projects that took place here, was the marking of the front line here in Flanders with trees and then colour-coded bits of metal around them showing the British and the German trenches. So you can see as you're doing this, walk across to one of these trees and you're on that bit of ground. And there's an app you can download that enables you to sort of follow that on the ground, and it's well worth doing that when you come. So going over to the edge of the wood, and we're pretty much on the German front line at that particular point, we can look back and again see just how soberingly close the British lines were to these German positions here. And on the 7th of June 1917, with the explosion of the mine, the German front line here was pretty much demolished by that explosion, and the German garrison neutralised, together with a huge amount of artillery that was dropped on the German positions as part of the Battle of Messines. This initial phase of the advance, the move from the British front line into the German positions, was, compared to previous battles of the Great War, pretty easy, and the units from the 23rd Division that advanced across this ground took this position very, very quickly indeed. And as we come in here, there's a little path that goes off to the right that takes you up to the lip of the crater, and you come across a German bunker in here. It's a German observation bunker. They possibly could have had a machine gun in there, but I suspect it was probably more for observation, that was just behind their frontline positions in this area, and it gives you a bit of an indication as to the type of bunkers that the Germans were building here. But we'll continue up the path to the lip of the crater, and the trees open up. If ever there is a perfect mine crater to come and look at, the Caterpillar crater that we're looking at now is it. Why the Caterpillar crater? Well, this bit of spoil that ran across this bit of ground on this side of the railway cutting, from the air, the British believed looked like it was roughly the shape of a caterpillar. So this knoll of ground was known as the Caterpillar before the explosion of the mine, and when the mine was blown and the crater formed, it became known as the Caterpillar crater. This perfectly formed crater, which when you look back into aerial photographs going back to the 70s and indeed beyond, nothing really has been done here. They've cleaned some of the trees away in recent times, but there's been no sort of ground maintenance here. So it's pretty much, as it was at the time. And it is the results of the explosion of over 70,000 pounds of ammonite explosive here on the 7th of June 1917, when as one of these 19 Messines mines, one blown on this side of the railway line here, one just to the north on the other side on Hill 60 itself, were crucial in helping neutralise the German positions right along the Messines Ridge, and allowing the British and Commonwealth forces to advance from one side of the ridge to the other in a single day and capture this huge swathe of ground. If you've been down to the chalky downlands of the Somme and visited craters like Hawthorne Ridge or the one at La Boisselle, or Lochnagar crater, when you look at where those positions were, or the positions that they were blown on, they're very much on the front line. They blew up front-line positions, and this was one of the lessons learned from the Battle of the Somme with these mining operations, is that the explosion of those mines, both with Hawthorne and Lochnagar, only killed a mere handful of the defenders, of the German soldiers that defended that ground, and so didn't have quite the effect on the outcome of the battle that they'd hoped. The difference with Messines was that the tunnellers didn't just tunnel underneath the German front line, they went beyond that into the second line, where it was realised by that stage the bulk of the German dugouts were located, and therefore the bulk of the German garrison was located. And the idea was these mines would help destroy or entomb those garrisons within those dugouts, enabling the infantry that would go into the assault and capture the front line positions. It would greatly assist them in doing so. And indeed, it proved to be part of that battle's success, the explosion of mines beyond the German forward defences into their sort of hinterland, if you like, where the bulk of their defending forces were located, was certainly a crucial part of the outcome of this operation. For many years it was believed that the combined explosion of these 19 mines had resulted in 10,000 German soldiers being killed instantaneously at 3:10 in the morning on the 7th of June 1917, when these mines were blown. But recent research, and there's a really good article by Simon Jones, which again I'll put a link to on the podcast website, debunks some of this myth. I think there's a lot of confusion throughout the war with the concept of casualties and what they relate to, and the way the Germans reported their dead were different to ours. But I think that the 10,000 figure is the wider impacts of the entire battle on the German forces that were here. It's no doubt, however, that the mines probably resulted in the death of several thousand German soldiers, but not quite the 10,000 that is claimed. Nevertheless, they had this absolutely key impact on the outcome of the battle. And like many battles of the Great War, it's not just the level of casualties that's part of the myth, it's the way that the mines went off. Quite often we hear that they went off one by one, so from north to south in some accounts, or from south to north, and you could have stood back and seen these eruptions of flame as each mine went off, popping up on the horizon one by one. Well, it didn't quite work like that. There were delays with some mines. They were all meant to go off simultaneously, and if you'd have stood back and watched them, and sadly I don't know of any particular accounts that where somebody did that, but if you'd have done that, you'd have seen one go off on the left, one go off on the right, one go off ahead of you, and another one. So there wouldn't have been any sort of pattern to it. So it wasn't like a pack of dominoes going off with one after the other. It was a series of explosions, which, although the Germans knew that we were tunnelling here, they had no realisation that we're tunnelling on this scale and were able to pull off an operation like this, causing such catastrophic damage and casualties to their frontline defences. It was a battle-changing operation, Messines, in all sorts of ways, but for the tunnellers it was their finest hour, but in some respects their final hour. There was never another period of the war in which the front was as static as this, to allow the creation of tunnelling galleries and the placement of mines on this scale again. As the war went more mobile from 1917 into 18, tunnellers found themselves building dugouts and approach tunnels and positions behind the lines rather than working on key operations like this. When I first used to come to the battlefields here in the 1980s, this crater was totally inaccessible. It was on private ground, and you risked getting some buckshot in your backside if you tried to come into here. The farmer did not want visitors. Eventually this ground was bought by the government of West Flanders, and it's now opened as a public park, and you can wander all the way through it and see this. So again, it's one of those great improvements that has taken place on the battlefields, allowing access to places like this and for us to be able to come up and see an impressive crater like the Caterpillar crater. So from here we're going to retrace our steps back down the path, back over no man's land to the railway bridge. It's always good to pause on the railway bridge to look down into the cutting. There was an episode there during the early part of the centenary when a train jumped the tracks slightly, and it was to do with the subsidence of some of the tunnels beneath this position had actually moved the rails slightly. So the sort of echoes of the Great War and the aftermath of the Great War, it's not just about the shells in the fields or the recovery of human remains, it's things like this too. The Great War is never going to not be part of this landscape in any shape or form. So we'll go over the bridge, go into the beginning of the Hill 60 Memorial area, and we'll begin there. We've heard that the dump and the Caterpillar were formed by the creation of the railway cutting here in the 19th century, and what we call Hill 60 was formed in exactly the same way. This artificial hill was a sort of an unofficial park before the war. I believe it was known as Lovers' Knoll to the locals. It was a place where lovers came to on a summer's evening and did what lovers do best, read poetry to each other. But by the time of the Great War, it took on a somewhat more ominous aspect. And the front lines reached here in 1914 during the First Battle of Ypres, when French troops were in this area around Zillebeek, and they stopped the Germans here as part of that advance. Just off to their left were guardsmen in the little hamlet of Klein-Zillebeek. The outcome of that First Battle of Ypres on this southern part of the Ypres-Flanders battlefields was the Germans took most of the high ground. So they got up on to the top of this area of Lovers' Knoll, which was on the map 60 metres above sea level, and that's how it got its name, Hill 60, the 60 referring to metres and not feet, and they could look down into the city of Ypres itself, and this was true along most of the Messines Ridge, going right down to the French-Belgian border near Plugstert. On what was essentially a flat battlefield, any rising ground like this would be hotly contested, so it's no accident that for much of the rest of the war this was hotly contested ground. The key to understanding the battles of Flanders is that it was pretty much a continuous battle for the possession and repossession of this so-called high ground, most of which, like Hill 60, was no more than tens of metres above sea level. But as we come on to this initial part of the hill, we see two memorials here, a British memorial to our right, and then in a slightly separate fenced-off area, an Australian memorial. That one commemorates the men of the Australian Tunnelling Company that took over from the Canadians, you'll remember, and did the final work leading up to the explosion of the Messines mines here in 1917. There's an Australian film called Beneath Hill 60 that relates the story of these men, and it's well worth having a look at. It's got a few generalisations, shall we call it, in it, but nevertheless it's got some quite good effects and gives you a bit of an insight into that incredible war beneath the Western Front. When you look at the Australian Memorial, it's got some nicks in the bronze panels that are on there from bullets, which may well be from operations here in 1940, which we'll talk about a little while later, but also could relate to an incident on the railway line when a group of French and Belgian resistance men were involved in a fracas with the Germans here during the Second World War. We're going to have a podcast somewhere further down the line where we look at some stories to do with these battlefields around Ypres in World War II, so we'll tell that story another day. And we'll move next to the memorial, the British memorial we can see here, which is to the 14th Light Division. Now, they were a light infantry division made up of men from Kitchener's Army, wartime volunteers, and you've got battalions like the regiments like the Rifle Brigade and the King's Royal Rifle Corps, Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, King Shropshire Light Infantry, and so on. And they were formed in 1914, came across to the Western Front, and they fought for a considerable period of their service in the early years of the war in the ground around Ypres, but never here at Hill 60. This is not one of their battle honours or one of their battlefields, so how come this memorial is here? Now, I often hear people describe that this is a memorial to a unit that fought here, but it isn't. This memorial was originally at another location on the battlefields, at a place called Railway Wood, which is just north of Hoog up on the Bellewaerde Ridge, quite close to Ypres. And the 14th Light Division spent quite a few months up there, and on the 25th of September 1915, which was the day of the Battle of Loos, it was one of the areas where there was a diversionary attack and men went into action to try and draw the German attention away from operations in France. And the 14th Light Division suffered quite heavy losses up there on the Bellewaerde Ridge around Railway Wood. So as that was their first battlefield of the Great War, it was the site that they chose to have their memorial, which was unveiled in the early 1920s and remained up there until the 1970s, when the ground around Hoog and Bellewaerde was sold off to become what is now the Bellewaerde Park that many of you will have seen by travelling along the Menin Road. And Baron de Vink, who owned that ground, wasn't sure of the fate of that particular area and what would happen to it, so he suggested that the memorial be moved, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who were responsible for the maintenance of it, moved it to its current location then. And during the centenary there was some talk of it going back to Railway Wood, because in the end there was no need to have moved it. And I hope that one day that happens, because it's out of context here. It's a useful memorial to have a look at because it shows you the complete order of battle of the division, shows how the three infantry brigades were formed and the support troops from all the different arms of service, engineers, medical, artillery, transport, veterinary and so on. So it's useful to explain to a group or with people that you're with how an infantry division operated on the battlefield, but really it should be back in its original context. So from there we'll take a little gate that'll take us onto a wooden pathway. This was something that was put in during the First World War centenary, and we'll follow it to where the first few steps are, and we'll stop here because where we are now, we're on the British front line, and the wooden steps go down into a gully we can see starting to our right and passing in front of us and going across to our left through the trees. Very often there's sheep in there cutting the grass, and a big sphere you can see in there, which is a German sea mine from the coast, which used to be part of a museum, which we'll talk about a little bit further along. Where we are now is on the British front line for this particular area, and if we look across this gully, which in fact is not really a gully at all, it's completely man-made. What we're seeing here are mine craters. So many mine craters have been blown that they're all overlapping, forming this man-made gully going from our right across in front of us over to our left. And on the far side of this gully we can see the steps going back up, and that's where the German front line was. So even closer together here than they were on the other side of the railway line in front of the Caterpillar. And for 2 years, from mid-1915 to mid-1917, this is how both sides lived here, facing each other across these craters, mines going off on a regular basis, raiding, bombardments, rifle grenades, trench mortars, gas attacks, sniper activity, you name it. This was classic attritional trench warfare taking place here. and thousands and thousands and thousands of men from many British regiments and many Commonwealth Empire units passed through here, and on the German side, unit after unit passed through as well. Despite all the toing and froing and all the activity here, neither side conclusively took Hill 60. One portion of it would remain in enemy hands, and eventually it would be retaken, and the toing and froing would continue for a big chunk of the war. That was until the 7th of June 1917, with the explosion of these two massive mines, the Hill 61 being 53,500 pounds of explosive underneath the second line German positions just beyond the gully. So the mine craters in front of us are not the Messines one. That's a bit further back, and we'll see that in just a moment. The 12th West Yorks then attacked from where we're standing now, moved across, protected by their bombardment, got into the remains of the German positions, pushed on through the crater, and then continued with their advance, leapfrogging unit after unit, moving its way down to Battlewood beyond and down to the outskirts of the village of Hollebeek. So this was, again, a very successful operation, and Hill 60 was taken. So we'll walk that little bit of no man's land now, go down the steps, through the gully, through the mine craters, up to the other side, to the German side, and we'll pause to think yet again how close both sides were here. And that'll take us up onto the grass beyond. We'll see some bits of concrete sticking out of the grass at different points. There were quite a number of German bunkers up here, and we'll continue to a much larger bunker at the back, which is probably one of the most visited bunkers anywhere on the Western Front. And again, there's a lot of mythology about this bunker and a lot of stories about it. It's quite a simple story, really, because it's not one bunker, it's two. There's an original German bunker here, which is probably a command or headquarters or signal bunker. And when the ground was captured, the Australian engineers then moved in here in January of 1918, and they constructed a new bunker on the back of the German one. So it was men of the 4th Field Company of the Australian engineers that did this, and they didn't amend an existing bunker, cut holes in it or anything like that. They built a brand new bunker on top of the existing German bunker. And in Peter Oldham's excellent book Armageddon's Walls, which is a gazetteer of the bunkers along the Western Front, he's even got a plan in there showing how this construction was made. It wasn't a defensive bunker, it wasn't a machine gun bunker. We can see there's two apertures at the fronts, which was part of the observation post, and there's a little indent in the base of it where a trench would have run into that to allow access into the main body of the bunker within. It was used by men of the 2nd Australian Field Artillery Brigade, and from here, across the shattered trees of Battle Wood, they could see right across to Hollebeek, which is where the Australians were holding the line during that early part of 1918, and they were spotting for their guns. So when the Germans were seen to be moving in their trenches, or fire was called for by one of the units in the forward position there, they would spot it from here and get a very good view, protected, of course, as well by the concrete bunker that they were in. Now, another one of the stories is the bunker was turned round for the Second World War and reused. Well, again, that's not true. Where we see it now is in exactly the position it was in at the end of the war in 1918. And I've got a photograph that was taken by an army nurse who came on a battlefield tour here that shows the bunker at that time, which, again, I'll put on the podcast website. And nothing really has changed. The hill's grown up a little bit in terms of the undergrowth and so on, but the position of the bunker is exactly the same. Now, in the Second World War, there was fighting in this area. In May 1940, the German army was coming down the two roads close to here, over to our left at Klein-Zillebeek. They were coming from the direction of Menin along there, but the main force was coming from Hollebeek, having got over the railway line and coming down into Ypres along the Hollebeek-Ypres road. The bulk of the fighting was actually where the Caterpillar crater is located. There was an officer and several men killed in action there in May 1940, who were then subsequently reburied in the Second World War plot in Bedford House Cemetery. But there was no actual fighting here on Hill 60 itself, from what I can gather from the research that I've done on this part of the battlefield. And it does seem that the bunker was used as a headquarters very briefly, but there was no sort of firefight here. So the damage that we see done to this area on some of the monuments is probably later damage rather than combat damage from the 1940 actions that were here. But going round the back of the bunker, we come up over the top of the hill again, and we can see the undulating nature of the ground here, showing what a shattered battlefield this was. Rose Coombs, who we spoke about in a previous podcast, in her book Before Endeavours Fade, the old Bible, as it were, to the Western Front battlefields, reckons that something like 8,000 men still lie buried here on Hill 60. Now, I don't think there's any way of ever verifying that, but it certainly was the field grave of so many men from so many different nationalities who fought here throughout the 4 years of the Great War. That brings us up to the Queen Victoria Rifles Memorial, and this is a replacement of one that was here before. It wasn't destroyed. Again, there's a bit of a myth about this. It wasn't destroyed in combat in 1940. The Germans blew it up, perhaps because it contained a reference to Queen Victoria. Who knows what the reason was behind that, but the Germans destroyed it rather than it being hit by a tank shell or artillery or anything. And this was the post-war replacement. Before the war, you accessed it via a gate and followed a little path and some steps up through a planted area. And again, I'll put an image of what that looked like on the podcast website. The Queen Victoria Rifles were the 1st 9th Battalion of the London Regiment, and they fought their first major action of the Great War here in April of 1915 during the Second Battle of Ypres. On a single day here during that battle, there were 4 Victoria Crosses awarded to men of the Queen Victoria Rifles and the 1st Battalion, the Surrey Regiment. The QVR's officer that got the Victoria Cross here was Harold Woolley, and he went on to become the Reverend Harold Woolley. And my old pal John Dray, who I've mentioned a few times on this podcast, in the 1960s he accompanied a lot of Royal British Legion veterans groups to the battlefields for the 50th anniversary. And Harold Woolley was one of his boyhood heroes. He'd inherited his dad's books on the Great War when John's father had passed away when he was only 12. These wounds from the Great War had finally caught up with him, and he died quite a relatively a young man. And John worshipped his dad and cherished those books, and there were lots of pictures of Harold Woolley with his grenades, throwing them at the German positions here on Hill 60. So when he was given the news that he was going to pick up the Reverend Woolley and take him across to Hill 60 for one of the anniversary trips, he was absolutely delighted and still expected to see this strapping 6-foot public school boy, and instead it was an old retired vicar who answered the door at his vicarage in London when John went to pick him up. Another man awarded the Victoria Cross in the same action with the East Surrey Regiment was Edwin Dwyer. He was the young working-class lad from London who's buried at Flatiron Copse Cemetery near Mametz Wood on the Somme. And in a previous podcast on Mametz Wood, we included the recording that he made talking about his early experiences in the war. When he went back to Britain following the action here on Hill 60 and to receive the award of the Victoria Cross, he went on recruiting marches and was recorded, had his voice recorded. The only soldier, as far as we're aware, who actually died in the war, the only ordinary soldier to have his voice recorded during the entire 4 years of the conflict. So an incredible recording, and worth going back to that earlier podcast to listen to that as a follow-up to this. But as we stand here at the Queen Victoria Rifles Memorial and we look around the hill, we can see the wooden duck boarding here that's now to facilitate visiting to the site. It all reflects how the hill has changed since the end of the war. In 1920, incredibly, the hill was bought by an individual to preserve it, and that was Lieutenant Colonel Corston, who'd served here with the Queen Victoria Rifles. He then later sold half of his share to the hill to John Calder, who was an Australian brewer whose son had served in this area with the Lovat Scouts. In 1930, 10 years later, a decision was made to give the hill in perpetuity to the British nation, and it was donated to the then Imperial War Graves Commission, who maintained it from that period onwards up until around about the time of the Great War Centenary, when, as I understand it, the ownership transferred to the West Flanders government, and it is they that maintain it today. And the walkways and the changes that we've seen in recent times here all come from them and not from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Coming down from the Queen Victoria Rifles Memorial, we come down into the far end of the gully overlooking the mine craters, and there's a gate ahead of us, probably where the original gate was that took you up onto the memorial in the interwar period. And ahead of us on the other side of the road now is a modern cafe, the Hill 60 Cafe, which is a very nice place to go into for a welcome drink and some lunch. But if we look around this grounds, these are all modern buildings. There's a supermarket across to our right, there's some modern houses to our right and some to our left, one built quite close to the railway crossing in the early 2000s. Originally, this was an open bit of ground, and originally in that interwar period when Hill 60 was a major location on every tour of the battlefields here, whether it was for pilgrims or the tourists that were already beginning to come across to these battlefields at that stage. There was a trench museum here. Now, this was one of several of these trench museums that existed in Flanders at that time. There was one up at Newport, for example, on the Belgian coast. There was one at Dixmude, the Trenches of Death, which is now maintained by the Belgian government. Originally, that was a private museum. There was Sanctuary Woods, Hill 62, which we've discussed in a previous podcast. And these trench museums largely were restricted to the battlefields in Belgium. You didn't see them in France, although there were some areas of officially preserved trenches, such as Le Lange in the Vosges, right down at the far end of the Western Front. This one seems to date from that period when Lieutenant Colonel Corsten owned Hill 60, and in the stretch of ground where all these modern houses are now, there was a massive reconstructed area of British trenches with towers you could go up to look down on the trenches, tons of detritus. That sea mine that we saw in one of the mine craters dates from this period when the Trench Museum, was here. You could wander around. There were some original features, entrances to some of the mining galleries, and there was quite a big museum here with a big collection of battlefield artefacts, and indeed a shop and where you could buy souvenirs. Henry Williamson, in The Wet Flanders Plain, his account of visiting the battlefields in the 1920s, talks about coming here and there being tables set up with everything from buttons to revolvers laid out for you to buy. So this was part of the commercial aspect of the interwar battlefield period. And again, I'll put some pictures up on the website showing what this trench museum looked like at that time. It was quite impressive. A lot of veterans, British veterans who'd stayed on to work on the cemeteries or had married local girls and stayed on as part of the British community in Ypres, worked on these trenches. The work of constructing cemeteries had come to an end, and a few of them were unemployed, and this led to them digging these trenches as a need, really, for the visitors coming back. As the trenches with themselves, the original ones, were being filled in, people wanted to see trenches, so trenches were created for them at this site. It seems to have closed, obviously, around about the time of the Second World War, when visitors came here no more, but it was not reconstituted in the period after World War II, and the collection seems to have been dispersed. There was a cafe still here then at that time called the Queen Victoria Rifles Cafe, with a little museum in it. And in the 1980s, the museum at Sanctuary Wood was split in two following the death of the owner. His son, Jack Shear, kept the trenches and the bulk of the museum, and a big chunk of the actual original collection went to an uncle who set up a provisional museum on the Menin Road, and then took over this cafe in the 80s and set up a new Queen Victoria Rifles cafe museum here with stereoscopic views, lots of artefacts, rooms out the back with machine guns and mortars and all sorts of stuff in. And then in the early 2000s, the cafe closed. The new building we see there now was built instead, and the collection was sold to the In Flanders Fields Museum and the Passchendaele Museum at Zonnebeek. So like many parts of the Western Front battlefields, this site has evolved not just during the war, but in the post-war period as well. As a site of remembrance, it went from being a commercial site where you paid to go in trenches and went up viewing towers and went in tunnels and saw a museum. It then went over to public ownership with the donation of the hill to the British nation and the care by the Imperial War Graves Commission following the Second World War, when battlefield visitors declined. After that period, it became a bit of a quiet backwater once more until the 90s moved into the 2000s, and the number of school groups coming here and the number of adult groups coming here made this into yet again one of the most visited parts of the battlefield. So the battlefields change so regularly, so much over the years. Next year will be 40 years since I've been visiting the battlefields around Ypres, and I've seen so much come and go and disappear, even in my 4 decades of doing it. With all the decades before that, so much had changed again. And as we walk back away from the gate for the moment to the edge of the gully, the edge of the mine craters, we think of that long period of static warfare here, with the British and Commonwealth soldiers dug in on the right along the edge of what's now a road in which people drive along to go to the supermarket or visit their aunt, and the Germans dug in just a few yards opposite, amongst where the trees were now and the sheep graze. and it seems quite incredulous to us that this could ever have been the case here. And then we think of how this became such a sight for tourists in that post-war period, and you wonder as you stand here what the ghosts of those 8,000 men that Rose Coombs wrote about, what they must have thought of that period, seeing bullets and bayonets and relics and helmets laid out on tables for sale as trinkets almost. The evolution of the battlefields, the ever-changing nature of this ground. But it always makes us reflect, always makes us think, and forever compels us to return somehow to the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.